This is a piece of racing history here in Daytona Beach. The last part of famed NASCAR mechanic Smokey Yunick's garage.
For decades, gearheads whispered about a locked-up shop in Daytona Beach that supposedly held the secrets NASCAR never wanted the public to see. The story went that somewhere behind a rusted roll-up door sat forbidden engines, banned blueprints, and technology so far ahead of its time that the sports rulebook couldn't survive it. It's a great campfire story. It's also mostly wrong. What actually happened when that building was finally cleared out is stranger, funnier, and in some ways more impressive than any conspiracy tale, because the truth didn't need Hollywood to make it interesting. The man at the center of it all was Henry Smokey Yunick, a mechanic, engineer, and full-time thorn in NASCAR's side who spent half a century proving that the smartest person in the room usually wasn't wearing a suit. Smokey passed away on May 9, 2001, at 77 years old, after a long fight with leukemia. He died at home in Daytona Beach, not far from the shop that had made him a legend. That shop, a squat building he nicknamed the best damn garage in town, had actually sat closed since 1987. Smokey shut it down himself, telling anyone who asked that there simply weren't good mechanics left worth training. For 14 years it sat there, untouched, a time capsule waiting for someone to open it. When his family finally did, they didn't find a hidden bunker guarded by secrecy. They found a life's work in physical form, tools, half-finished projects, filing cabinets full of paperwork, and mixed in with all of it, a handful of machines that had genuinely rewritten what people thought was possible from an engine. The reveal wasn't a raid. It was a garage sale. And that contrast between the myth of a sealed vault and the reality of a public event where anyone with cash could walk out with a piece of history is really where this story gets interesting. During Speed Weeks in February 2002, roughly 9 months after Smokey's death, his widow Marjorie, everyone called her Marge, opened the doors of the shop to the public. There was no velvet rope, no appointment, only viewing for collectors with deep pockets. It was first come, first served, spread out over several days, and it drew people from well outside Florida. Fans made the drive from as far as the Pacific Northwest and the New England coast just to stand inside a building they'd only ever seen in magazine photos. What they found inside looked less like a museum and more like a shop that had simply stopped in the middle of a workday. Hand tools went for a few dollars each. Boxes of assorted racing parts, the kind of stuff any serious mechanic accumulates over 40 years, sold for $20 a crate. There was a vintage GMC dealership sign that still worked, stacks of old hubcaps, coils of exhaust tubing, and Smokey's own manual typewriter, the one he'd apparently used to bang out furious letters to sanctioning bodies and magazine editors alike. Prices were almost aggressively reasonable for most of it, which was very much the point. Marge summed up the whole event with a line that stuck with people who were there. She said the place was basically a junkyard, just a first-class one. She wasn't being modest. She meant it as a compliment to her late husband's approach to hoarding useful things. She also explained, more than once, that this had been Smokey's explicit wish. He didn't want his tools sitting behind glass in some climate-controlled shrine. He wanted them back in the hands of people who'd actually use them, or at least people who'd appreciate holding something that had once helped build a winning race car. That instinct fit the man. Smokey had spent much of his career doing the opposite of hoarding, rescuing broken-down machines, engines other people had given up on, and coaxing them back to life. According to his family, the idea of his own legacy being locked away, untouchable, controlled by wealthy collectors who'd never turn a wrench themselves, would have driven him up a wall. The money raised from the sale went toward a foundation meant to support new innovation in motorsports, which meant even the liquidation of his shop was, in its own way, still funding the kind of experimentation he'd spent his whole life chasing. His daughter, Trish, later said something that captured the emotional side of the sale better than any inventory list could. People wanted the physical stuff, the wrenches, the parts, the signage, but what she was holding on to was something nobody could put a price tag on: the stories. Her husband, Chris, had his own way of summing up Smokey's reputation, calling him NASCAR's most beloved rulebender. It wasn't an insult in that family. It was practically a compliment, because everyone who knew Smokey understood that half of his genius was finding the gaps in a rulebook before the people who wrote it even knew the gaps existed. If the tool sale was the surface layer, the real substance was underneath, in a handful of engines that Smokey and his collaborators had spent years perfecting, mostly on their own dime, largely ignored by the manufacturers who should have been paying attention. The crown jewel of this collection was something called the hot vapor engine, and if you've never heard of it, that's kind of the point of this story. The basic idea sounds almost too simple to be revolutionary. Instead of trying to keep the fuel-air mixture cool before combustion, which is standard practice in virtually every gasoline engine, Smokey did the opposite. He used waste heat, the kind normally thrown away through the exhaust and cooling system, to superheat and fully vaporize the fuel before it ever reached the cylinders. The mixture ran through a custom turbine device under the carburetor, then through an insulated, heat-wrapped manifold, climbing past 450 degrees Fahrenheit before combustion. Fully vaporized fuel burns far more efficiently than a liquid fuel mist, which let the engine run on an extremely lean air-to-fuel ratio, something in the range of 20 parts air to 1 part fuel, well beyond what a normal carbureted engine could tolerate without stalling or misfiring. The test mule for this concept was a modified Pontiac Fiero 4-cylinder, the same basic Iron Duke engine that came stock with around 90 horsepower and decent but unremarkable highway mileage. Smokey's version, running entirely on a carburetor with no computer management at all, was tested at roughly 250 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque, while returning somewhere around 50 miles per gallon on premium fuel. For a purely mechanical, pre-computer engine built in a small independent garage, those are numbers that still sound implausible today. And crucially, this wasn't just Smokey's own claim. Outside labs and manufacturer engineers who examined the engine confirmed it could meet the strict emission standards of the era without any electronic fuel injection or onboard computer at all. The roots of the idea actually went back to the 1950s, developed alongside a GM dyno technician and carburetor specialist who worked closely with Smokey on pushing combustion past its normal limits. Their collaboration produced several prototype vehicles over the years, built on different platforms, each one squeezing out mileage numbers that were startling for their time, consistently over 40 miles per gallon with power output that punched well above what the base engine was rated for. There were flirtations with actual production. A pickup truck program came close. A licensing arrangement with an aftermarket cam company got discussed. None of it ever stuck. The reasons were the usual ones that kill promising automotive tech: concerns about long-term durability, the cost of retooling a factory line, legal exposure, and a healthy dose of corporate stubbornness. Engineers inside big manufacturers simply weren't eager to adopt a breakthrough that came from outside their own walls. But here's the important part. These weren't just claims on paper that died with him. The physical engine survived. Several stayed in the family after his death, and enthusiasts who understood exactly what they were looking at worked to keep at least one running example on the road for years afterward, eventually placing it in a public collection where it remains on display today. Another example reportedly found its way into the hands of a major national institution for long-term safekeeping. In other words, you can still go look at proof that this technology worked, sitting in a museum, not buried in a rumor. Engines rot, get sold, or get lost to time. Patents don't. And Smokey, it turns out, was a prolific filer, putting his name on close to a dozen U.S. patents between the late 1970s and the mid-1990s, covering everything from fuel conditioning systems to engine oil handling to a design for a racetrack safety barrier. Those documents are public record, permanent proof that his ideas weren't garage tall tales. They were formally documented, dated, and defensible engineering. A cluster of those patents, filed through the 1980s, covered the exact mechanics of the hot vapor system, the apparatus itself, the method for operating it, and the fuel conditioning process that made the whole thing work on the Fiero test engine. Those patents eventually entered the public domain in the early 2000s, meaning any engineer curious enough to dig them up today can study exactly how Smokey pulled it off. He also had earlier patents covering a pressure venting system from the late 1970s, and later ones covering oil change procedures and engine testing methodology through the early 1990s, the kind of unglamorous but genuinely useful innovations that rarely get talked about compared to the flashier engine work. His most contentious ideas, though, weren't about horsepower at all. They were about safety, and they tended to arrive decades before the sport was ready to listen. In the early 1960s, he built a pneumatic jack system designed to lift a stock car off the ground almost instantly during a pit stop, cutting service time dramatically. NASCAR wasn't interested. Around the same period, he mounted an oversized wing over the engine of an Indy car, generating serious cornering grip through added downforce, only to have it banned almost immediately by the sanctioning body over concerns about straightaway drag and overall safety. Decades later, wings became mandatory equipment across nearly every major open-wheel and sports car series in the world. The most sobering example involves crash protection. In the early 1980s, long before anyone had developed the energy-absorbing barriers used at racetracks today, Smokey proposed a softwall concept built from stacked tires sandwiched inside heavy plywood sheeting, designed to absorb impact energy instead of returning it straight back into the car and driver. NASCAR passed on it at the time. Drivers kept racing against solid concrete for years afterward. Smokey eventually formalized the concept into a patent in the mid-1990s, describing a racetrack design incorporating this kind of impact-absorbing barrier. It would be years later, following a string of high-profile fatal crashes, that the sport finally adopted modern energy-absorbing wall systems that operate on a strikingly similar principle. No discussion of Smokey Yunick is complete without the car that's become shorthand for his entire reputation, the so-called 7/8 scale Chevelle. For years, the story got repeated as though Smokey had literally built a shrunken race car, a scale model somehow passed off as full-size. It's a fun image. It's also not what happened, and the actual math proves it. A true 7/8 scale Chevelle would have been nearly 10 inches narrower and over 2 feet shorter than a stock car, sitting on a wheelbase so short that any inspector, or honestly any fan walking through the pits, would have spotted it instantly. What Smokey actually built was subtler and, in a way, far more impressive. Working with a handful of 1966-bodied Chevelles, some of which benefited from early developmental work done in cooperation with Chevrolet's own engineering team, he made a series of small aerodynamic adjustments that were nearly invisible to the naked eye, but added up to a real performance advantage at high speed. He shifted the body slightly rearward on the chassis to rebalance weight distribution. He raised and smoothed the floor pan to control airflow underneath the car. He subtly lowered the roofline and window openings, adjusted the rake of the windshield, and reworked the fenders and drip rails just enough to reduce drag. He even modified the front bumper to act as a mild aerodynamic spoiler. None of the sheet metal was dramatically different from stock. The geometry, though, had been sculpted with an engineer's understanding of what happens to airflow once a car crosses 180 miles per hour. Eventually, NASCAR's inspectors noticed something wasn't adding up and scrambled to create the sport's first standardized measuring templates, using a wrecked competitor's car as their baseline. The process was messy, and it permanently changed how every car on the grid would be checked from that point forward. It also worked spectacularly well before anyone caught on. A driver piloting one of these modified Chevelles became the first person to qualify at over 180 miles per hour at Daytona, a milestone that stunned the field. Smokey personally denied the scale model myth on multiple occasions, both in magazine interviews and later in his own writing, insisting the changes were far more calculated than a simple shrink race story implied. That denial fits a broader pattern with him. He was famous for finding legal gray areas and exploiting them fully, coiling extra feet of fuel line tubing to sneak a few additional gallons of usable fuel capacity past inspectors being one of the more legendary examples. In his own later writing, he was unapologetic about it, essentially arguing that everyone else in the garage was bending the rules just as hard, if not harder, and that his own tricks were simply self-defense in an arms race nobody wanted to admit was happening. Machines and patents tell you what Smokey built. His autobiography tells you why he built it, and the toll it took to keep fighting an industry that often didn't want to hear from him. Titled Best Damn Garage in Town, the book was released as a massive multi-volume box set, packed with hundreds of photographs and organized around the major chapters of his life. His early stock car years, his Indy 500 work, and the inventions he never stopped chasing even after he'd officially walked away from the sport. He finished the manuscript essentially in a race against his own illness, publishing it as Leukemia Closed In, and it came out around the same time he passed away. A longtime friend narrated the audiobook version, giving Smokey's voice, sharp, profane, and completely unfiltered, one more life outside the printed page. Inside those pages, Smokey wrote at length about the moment that pushed him out of NASCAR entirely. His close friend, driver Fireball Roberts, was critically burned in a crash at Charlotte in 1964 and died from his injuries about 6 weeks later. The loss hit Smokey hard and pushed him into an aggressive campaign for better driver safety, particularly around fuel cell design. When NASCAR's founding leadership repeatedly rejected his proposals, Smokey eventually walked away from the sport around 1970, still furious that safety improvements he considered obvious kept getting shelved. The book also revealed an interesting gap between memory and official record when it came to his military service. Smokey often described flying dozens of combat missions as a bomber crewman during World War II. Official service records instead show he was drafted in the early 1940s, trained as a welder, and served on active duty through the middle of the decade, eventually earning the rank of second lieutenant and an air medal while attached to a bomber squadron overseas. Whether the exact mission count matched his own retelling or not, the documented record still confirms a genuinely decorated wartime service, which says something about how legends, even the ones people tell about themselves, tend to grow a little in the retelling without necessarily being hollow. His racing resume, at least, needs no embellishment. Across his career as a car owner and crew chief, Smokey's cars won dozens of NASCAR Cup Series races, claimed multiple championships, and took the checkered flag at the Indianapolis 500 as chief mechanic for the winning team in 1960. He was the first team owner to win back-to-back Daytona 500s in 1961 and 1962. By the time all was said and done, he'd been inducted into more than 30 Motorsports Halls of Fame, including the very first class of the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990. Here's the part that tends to get lost in the retelling. Almost none of what mattered most about Smokey Yunick disappeared. The building itself didn't survive. The property was sold off in 2003 as part of his estate plan. Most of the structures were eventually demolished, and the last remaining piece of the original garage burned down in a fire in April 2011. But by then, everything of real substance had already walked out the door a decade earlier. The proceeds from that 2002 sale funded a foundation dedicated to motorsports innovation, extending his life's obsession even after he was gone. The surviving hot vapor engines ended up split between family members, private collectors, and at least one public museum, where visitors can still see and, in one documented case, watch a fully restored version drive under its own power. His patents sit in the public domain, freely available for any engineer curious enough to study exactly how a man with no computer and a carburetor coaxed 250 horsepower and 50 miles per gallon out of a four-cylinder economy engine. The rules he forced NASCAR to rewrite, body templates, wing regulations, and eventually safety barrier design, are baked permanently into how the sport still operates today. So when people imagine what was found in Smokey Yunick's garage after his death, the honest answer isn't a hidden vault of banned secrets NASCAR tried to bury. It's something better: a public sale, an open paper trail, working machines you can still go look at, and a book that lets you hear the man explain himself.